You have 29 minutes to explain.
Okay, we're putting on a PL259 here, hopefully right the first time this time. I took the pipe cutter, very cute little pipe cutter, and wrapped it around the coax, spun it around a couple of times, tightening it up as I went to make an incision that didn't go all the way through the vinyl insulation, but most of the way. And took this X-Acto knife, very cute little modeling X-Acto knife, and cut the rest of the way through, being careful not to nick the insulation. Then making an incision this way, not going all the way through at first, but then all the way through at the end. Now I should be able to take my thumbnail and rip this insulation right off, like so. The next step is going to be to tin this coax shield. I'm going to tin it extra long and then cut it to length. So I need to find a way to get this coax to sit still. Use some random weight. And then I've got my big old soldering iron. And I need some big old solder. So the idea is to get the shield hot on its own and then melt some solder on the shield. It needs to lie pretty flat, and it should soak through the shield. We don't want to leave any blobs because then it won't fit in. So I'm trying to spread this stuff out a little. Whoops, left a blob there. And usually I use skinnier solder. This solder goes on real fast. Okay, now I need to get the underside of it. So I need to flip the coax over. A little bit further over. Like so. And hold that. Hold it up here so you have control over spin.
In the background today we have Animal Planet and aggressive raccoons.
Hopefully they're not coax chewing raccoons.
Oh, hopefully not.
Okay. That's a little bit of a blob on the bottom. Okay, that's pretty good. Now the next step is to let it cool down for a little while before handling it so as not to burn myself. After that happens, I'm going to take the connector. Notice I've already put the back shell of the connector onto the coax, so you can't forget that later.
Very, very smart.
And this is a screw-on type, not the fanciest kind, but the easiest kind to install. And it's going to sit on like this, so the threads line up pretty much with the end of the vinyl. And I'm going to need to cut the shield just past these solder holes before it gets to the insulation disc that holds up the center pin. So right about there. I'm going to make a little mark. So look for that mark in a second while I'm waiting for it to cool down.
And while we're waiting for it to cool, how about a message from our sponsor?
Who is our sponsor anyway?
That's a good question. We need a sponsor.
You need a keeper. I didn't say that.
Okay, so now I'm putting the pipe cutter on there again, lining it up with that mark I just made with the X-Acto knife. And now we're cutting through the tin shield. And in fact, I'm going to cut all the way through the tin shield and through most of the way through the dielectric insulation. So I'm making about a 3/4 of a turn and then spin the pipe cutter a couple of times. And that's far enough. Now you can see it's cut almost all the way through, but without nicking the center conductor. I can now just spin the excess insulation right off, like that. And inspecting the end to make sure there's no loose bits of wire that are going to cause a short later. It looks good. So there's a nice smooth top. The pipe cutter does a great job. Doesn't even need to be sharp. It's relying on the pressure more than the blade thickness. Now I see I've got a kind of a burr on the end of this, which is going to make it hard to stick through the connector, so I'm going to cut that off square with a nice sharp pair of cutters. And then slide the connector on, making sure the center goes through the center pin. Now as the threads of the connector begin to engage the plastic, it stops, and you have to apply a little bit of force, pushing in this way and turning like like tightening a screw, so that the threads that are inside the barrel here engage with the vinyl. And after a very short amount of time, it becomes too hard to turn by hand. So I'm going to get a pair of vice grips to turn it with. Now this is a step where things can go wrong. The coax itself can get twisted, or the connector can refuse to thread onto the vinyl if the vinyl's a little bit flared from the cutting. So we're going to hope for the best. Notice I'm watching to see that the connector is advancing onto the coax, and it is. And I'm applying a little bit of inward force along with a twist, not just relying on the threads to pull the connector forward. Now we're starting to see the shield show up in the solder hole, so we're getting close. I'm going to keep on turning until the shield completely fills up the solder holes, and then a little more. Okay, there we go. Now all I have to do is solder here and solder the center pin, and we're done. So the trick here is that the whole thing is going to get real hot when I solder, and it's going to try to melt the insulation, both outside insulation and inside insulation. So I want to use the minimum amount of heat that I can get away with. But I do need to get good wetting between the shield in there and the outside. Now, ideally I want to see a meniscus of solder inside each one of these holes, but I'll settle for like a half meniscus in most of the holes, if that's all I can conveniently get without overheating the connector. So I've got a blob of solder on the tip of my gun, so the next thing I'm going to do is melt it and then flick it off.
Michael, back up.
Okay. So now I'm just going to wait a little while the iron heats up the connector. There's no point in poking solder at it right away because it's just not going to be hot enough. And I don't want solder on the outside of the connector, although there'll be some inevitably. So I'm not going to hit the tip of the iron with any solder. I'm going to try to get it into the hole. Still not quite hot enough yet.
What are you doing?
We're installing a PL259 connector for an antenna feed line cable. See, now I'm getting a junction already between the shield, which was tinned, and the outside of the connector, which takes solder pretty well, being as how this is a reasonably decent quality connector. And that's pretty much what I want it to look like. And I don't need to do it for the other 3 holes. Should be much quicker because the connector is already hot. And it's real easy to get too much solder. Stand back, Michael.
Hot. Michael,
Okay,
stand back.
Stand way back. And now I need to turn it over. Coax
Are you
solder
doing smoking?
run around so much that some of them have already soldered themselves.
Smoking?
No, it's a soldering iron.
I wish I could still see. That's just flux. Okay, so I need to work on a couple of these holes still. Signalize here.
And you're
there, that's hiding the shield, but it might not be connecting to it. That's better. That looks good already. Alright, we'll declare victory on that solder.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry, honey.
Now, inspecting our work, we can see that I've not done a very good job of minimizing the heat because the jacket of the coax has started to melt around the connector. That's okay. It doesn't really cause a problem, but I could have been a little faster on soldering all those holes. What's left is to solder the tip there. That can be done with a much smaller soldering iron, but if you're quick like a bunny, you can do it with the big soldering iron and not have to get out the little one. I am going to use smaller solder though. This is my electronics size solder, real small. And I'd like to get the other side of this connector. Tangled up with the soldering iron. So it's got a little step in it, and I want the top. I want to hit the short end of the step, because I'm going to be cutting off everything that's beyond the long end of the step. So I'm just going to use the corner of the iron here. It shouldn't take it long to get hot. Not nearly as long as heating up the whole connector. There we go. That's nicely soldered. And these are flush cutters, so I should be able to step right up to the long end of the connector and pop that guy off. And assuming we haven't clobbered up the threads too much with solder, the shield should come right up here and screw on. I'm going to clobber up a little, and it's still rather warm, so we're going to let it cool down, and then we have to clear out these threads a little, and then it'll screw right on. Yeah, did get some solder in the threads. It's not supposed to happen.
Don't worry, we'll edit this part out.
Yeah, I've heard that before. Okay, so I'm just going to use the threads to self-cut with a little bit of help from my trusty vice grips. And another pair of mechanical aids. I'll have another handy-sized wrench. So I'll have to use the unhandy wrench. Now that's an unhandy wrench. Do not try this at home. I'm perfectly capable of applying enough force to destroy the entire works. Okay, that's probably enough. Alright, just a little more. Come on, baby. A little more force is required. This is definitely not supposed to be part of the process. Here we go. One each PL259 installed.